Welcome, everyone. My name is Brendan Hassett. I'm a professor of mathematics here at Brown, and I'm also the director of ICERM. ICERM is the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics. So we're funded by the National Science Foundation, the Simons Foundation, and Microsoft Research and other organizations. And we really focus on the interaction between mathematics and computation and experiment. So we'd like to see algorithms that come out of mathematical research, but we also like to see computational exploration, trying new ideas that can lead to discoveries in mathematics, and we want to encourage these different perspectives to interact with each other. So we're also very interested in the impact of algorithms and mathematics on society at large, and so I think the topic today is very much in that spirit. So let me introduce our speaker. So Skip Garibaldi is director of the Center for Communications Research at La Jolla, which is a division of the Institute for Defense Analyses. So he's been associate director of the Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics at UCLA, IPAM, which is one of our sister institutions, also supported through the National Science Foundation Institutes program. So he understands institutes very well. Before he came to La Jolla, he was the Winship Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at Emory University, and he took a postdoctoral position at ETH in Zurich. So among mathematicians, he's famous for his work in algebraic groups, especially exceptional groups. And so this is actually where I knew about Skip before, until recently. So his book, Cohomological Invariance in Galois Cohomology with Merkurjev and Serre, is one of the most important references in algebra. And so I really appreciate these contributions, and I'm a big fan. But probably for most of society who don't follow Galois cohomology, he's known for the work that he's done on lottery and the public policy aspects of it that have led to real changes in how lotteries are conducted in many states. So he's been interviewed in 2020, CNN, ABC. He's really had a big impact in public discussions of how these things should be conducted and what are the pitfalls of conducting them without proper attention to how people behave. So he's received many awards and distinctions. So he was the AMS-MA invited lecturer at the Joint Mathematics meeting. He's a fellow of the American Mathematical Society. He received an award for the Air Force for public service. And he received an award from the Mathematical Association of America, the Lester R. Ford Award, for one of his manuscripts about finding good bets in the lottery and why you shouldn't take them. So I think I've spoken long enough. So let me introduce Dr. Garibaldi to talk about his work on the lottery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I'm going to share my screen here and start with my slides a little bit. Thank you all for coming. This is one of the very few talks I've given by Zoom. So it still feels weird to me, even half a year into this pandemic. I wish I could be there in person to enjoy the amazing ICERM facilities and the famous Rhode Island calamari. Let me mention that because I'm not a professor at a university anymore, the Center for Communications Research, we're part of a federally funded research and development center that's a nonprofit corporation where we do mathematics proof theorems for the benefit of the federal government. So that's the kind of place I'm at now. This is mostly about work that I did at my previous job at UCLA. So I'm talking about the lottery today, and just to give you a sense of scale, the lottery is just this huge business. So the annual sales are around $80 billion. And when we talk about the lottery, it's really, these huge numbers are everywhere. So I feel like I need to give some context about what they mean. So as one example, that's about 10 times the NBA's global revenue. And it's kind of an unfair comparison because the NBA is talking about global and US lottery sales are purely domestic, but it gives you a sense of the size. And it's about twice Microsoft's global revenue, Microsoft being one of the largest corporations. And it's about what the US spends on corrections, which is a pretty all-encompassing amount, including incarceration, parole officers, and so on. That number comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is part of the executive branch. So that's a huge amount of dollars every year. So that's the business I'm talking about today. And I want to the main focus here is about an exploitative scheme that is ongoing, happening across the US, and illegal in many cases. So I want to emphasize that because when we talk about lottery shenanigans, there's a lot of them out there, and I'm kind of focused on a narrow part of it. But you may be familiar with other ones from having read about them in newspapers and magazines. So I'm going to talk about the other ones for a second, just to make sure our sort of context is straight. So one that's very close to ICERM's heart is this one that happened with respect to the game Cash Windfall in Massachusetts about a decade ago. And Jordan Ellenberg gave a talk here, a public lecture at ICERM in October 2015 about it. So the situation here is that because of the detailed rules of this very specific lottery game, sometimes it was profitable to buy tickets for some drawings in this game. So obviously, when people noticed this, they made a business out of it. And that's what Jordan talked about in his lecture and in his book. His book's about many other things. It's a great book. I recommend it to everybody, whether you're interested in the lottery specifically or not. But this is not what I'm talking about today, because this is not ongoing. It's just a few years in time. It's not nationwide. It's just Massachusetts. And it's totally legal. So not meeting any of my 3 criteria. Another thing I'm not talking about today are inside jobs. If you have special access to special information about what the winning numbers are going to be, or you can adjust what the winning numbers will be, then of course you have opportunities for lots of shenanigans. But those tend to be less mathematically and oriented and more focused on straight up detective work. So recently Eddie Tipton, you may have read newspaper articles about this. He was the head of information security for a multi-state lottery association. He rigged several multi-million-dollar lottery drawings. So he confessed to that, so I can write rigging instead of allegedly rigging. And then a while ago in the last century, there was a specific game that got rigged in Pennsylvania, and later they made a dramatic movie about it starring John Travolta called Lucky Numbers. Rotten Tomatoes doesn't necessarily recommend that movie, but it's a movie about a lottery scam, so we wanted to talk about it. Another thing I'm not talking about today is decoding misdesigned scratcher tickets. So I've put in here a picture of some scratcher tickets just to remind you in case you don't play the lottery or haven't in a long time. And if we look at this one down here, I hope you can see my cursor. Then there's a section here that's covered in wax. And so the usual system is you buy the scratcher ticket, you scratch off the wax, and there's some symbols underneath there that tell you what you won if you won anything. So in this scenario, the people who print the scratcher ticket screw up, and it's possible to tell by looking at the ticket before you scratch the wax off, and therefore before you buy it, whether or not it's a winner. So that happened to a few very specific games at very specific times at very specific places. And in that, if you knew the secret, if you figured out the secret, you could make some money in the lottery. So again, not ongoing, not widespread, and totally legal. But it's something that happened. Now it doesn't really happen anymore because the people who make the scratcher tickets know about this and they don't make those mistakes anymore. There's just a couple of companies basically that print scratcher tickets across the US and in Canada and so on. And so when they screw up one place, they learn about it and fix their operations in all the places. And then finally, there's some newspaper articles and magazine articles you might read about the so-called luckiest woman on earth. This is a specific person, Joanne Ginther. She has won some fairly big prizes in the Texas lottery. And I in no way mean to suggest that she's up to something illicit, but she definitely has a plan and is doing something enough that people wrote some articles about her. And what is the thing that she's doing? Like, what's her strategy? That's the question. And I don't know what that is, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. All right. So these are some things, like I said, I'm focused on something that's ongoing, nationwide, and in many cases illegal. The details of whether or not it's legal depend on state law, which varies a lot from state to state. So enough said about that. So my story starts with Lawrence Maurer. He's an investigative reporter. He was working for the Palm Beach Post, which is a print newspaper. Every time I talk about this material, that seems more and more anachronistic. So Anyway, so that's his job. And the details of his job are he's supposed to find interesting news stories, spend 4 to 6 months investigating them, and then write a series of articles about it. So that it's a really interesting job. And so he knew about some of these other shenanigans that I just talked about on the last slide. And he's in Florida. Florida's a pretty big state. There's lots of crazy things happening, just like any other big state. And he said, hey, what about the Florida lottery? Could something weird be going on in the Florida lottery? He needs his next article, right? So he's got to keep his nose, keep smelling around for news stories. So he contacts the Florida lottery. Well, before I get ahead of myself, I want to point out the logo here for the Palm Beach Post. I don't know if you've noticed their slogan is "Real News Starts Here." Nowadays, that you hardly bat an eye at it, but I want to point out that this slogan really predates the discussion of fake news. It's well before 2016. So whoever invented that slogan looks prescient in 2020. All right. So Lawrence is curious about the Florida lottery. So he contacts the lottery. He tries to get some information from them. And they're a little reluctant, but eventually they do it. Newspapers have lawyers to help them with these kinds of things. And so he gets a list of 1 million prizes that all the prizes have been given out by the Florida lottery up to that point were $600 or more. It's a big spreadsheet. Each one row per prize, more than 1 million rows, and each row has things like the winner's name, the winner's city, prize won, etc. For those of you who haven't spent a lot of time studying the minutia of lottery regulations like I have, the $600 number might be a little bit surprising. So let me explain. As you probably know, if you buy a lottery ticket and you win a prize, it's typically something small like $1 or $10. Then you just take your winning ticket to a grocery store or a gas station, any place that sells lottery tickets, and they'll just pay you cash on the spot. Very easy. So those kinds of prizes and wins are only very coarse information is tracked about those. So we don't really have much information about what those kinds of prizes are given out. But if you win a prize worth $600 or more, that's the rule in Florida and also in Rhode Island and in California, where I am, then you can't just go to your local gas station or grocery store. You have to actually go to your lottery office. And there's only a few of them in each state. There's 8 or 9 in Florida and California. And there's only one in Rhode Island located in Cranston. Could be an hour drive if you live in Southwest Rhode Island. So they're not super convenient. So, but anyway, you go to the lottery office and you have to fill out a form, and it's got all this information on it. And so the lottery has collected a lot of data about who's winning each prize, what game they played, and so on. So that's where we get the spreadsheet comes from. And for the rest of this talk, that's all. When I talk about lottery prizes, I'm talking about those kinds of prizes because those are the only ones I have information on. And when I talk about other states, it'll be whatever the number is for other states. In some other states, it's $500, so on. All right, so he has this data. And one of the things you should know is that it is super rare to win one of these prizes. So I've given this talk to a few thousand people over the course of the time I've been talking on this subject. And I ask, when I'm giving it to a live audience, in-person audience, people to raise their hand if they have ever won a prize in a state lottery worth $600 or more. And in the total time I've given this talk, I've gotten 2 people raise their hands. So it's a really rare thing, at least amongst the group of people who go to math talks, I guess. So, but it is pretty unusual. I certainly have not won a $600 prize in the lottery, and I've bought a fair amount of tickets. But what Lawrence found, which raised his reporter's antennae, is that some people had won more than 100 of these prizes. And so that's kind of shocking. It looks like pretty unlikely given what we know about how frequent these prizes are. So the question is like, how could that happen? What could be going on? And so there's a couple obvious scenarios that suggest themselves. One is you could definitely win that many prizes if you just spend a tremendous amount of money on tickets. That's just how probability works. Or you could be up to some shenanigans where what those are, it's kind of undefined, but you're not just buying tickets and gambling like a normal gambler. That's the option 2. So that's his theory. but it seems real suspicious. It really looks like shenanigans because, without even doing any mathematical analysis, I think we all feel in our gut, like the number of tickets spent must have been, the amount of money spent to buy tickets must have been truly enormous. And it's lots of Floridians, and they're not like Warren Buffett or other very rich people. So what does he do? So he eventually talks to the Florida Lottery Secretary about it. And when I say that job title, you should think CEO of the Florida Lottery. And she says, they're just lucky. That's what the lottery is all about. You can buy one ticket and you become a millionaire. So this is really putting out a third option I want to point out. So kind of building on the last slide, there's really three options now. The two default options where you just spend a tremendous amount of money on tickets. You could be up to some shenanigans, or you could spend a modest amount of money and just get amazingly lucky. That's the lottery's stance on what happened. Not shenanigans, not that they're super rich, but they just got super lucky. Well, people get lucky. It's a thing that happens. Well, don't believe it. So part of the goal of this talk is to convince, and the math that we did, the whole project, was to eliminate option 3, to provide a number for option 1. What is that huge amount? So that you can sort of use your human sense to realize if that makes sense given other context that Lawrence can discover. Because he's an investigative reporter, he has no problems going out and talking to people and asking them about stuff. And interviewing them. And so we have some way to gauge how much we believe 1, and then that would leave us with 2, being up to some shenanigans. So that's the point of this talk, is to use math to address 3 and 1. All right, so Lawrence recognized that there's some numerical issues here, and he doesn't have a math degree, but his gut is has a good instinctive understanding of the binomial distribution, I think I'd say, as a mathematician. So he realized that he could use some professional help, and he brought in some people. So besides me, you got Philip Stark. He's a statistician at UC Berkeley and currently Associate Dean of Math and Physical Sciences, and Richard Aradia, who's a probabilist at USC. I don't know why all 3 of us are from California, but that's the way it worked out. I'm sure that wasn't a design criterion. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of this problem. And so let's talk about what the actual issue is. I feel like the lottery secretary really did us a favor by introducing this meaty, for me, I feel it's very intriguing philosophical paradox. And by paradox, I really mean sensible reasoning, sound reasoning that leads to a conclusion that seems crazy, to paraphrase what's written there. So here's the paradox I mean. On the one side, and I'm just making these numbers up. Suppose someone spends $1,000 on lottery tickets. They could win 100 of these big prizes and be on our list 100 times. And as mathematicians, we can calculate what that probability is. Actually, if you've taken a college course in probability, you probably can too. Calculating that probability is a homework problem using the binomial distribution. And the takeaway there is it's not 0. So the way we do probability in math, we understand probability, says that that's a thing that could happen because the probability is not 0, although it is a very small number. So that's one side of the paradox. That's the sound reasoning. And here's the senseless conclusion. Come on, there's just no way. Like, we all know, if you've bought lottery tickets, you are well aware that it's probably pretty hard to win 100 prizes or $600 or more, that you'd probably have to spend really a lot of money on tickets. And I'll talk a little bit more later about why that's so hard. And it's not just how big is your pocketbook. So that's the paradox. And so how do we resolve it? Well, the resolution is always an issue of the problem is really in our brains, and we have to figure out how our understanding is flawed so that this paradox, which is conflicting with these 2 evidently true statements, are not actually in conflict. So the resolution is that some events, while having a non-zero probability, are so unlikely that we just know that they're not going to happen. So that's our lifetime experience. That's how come these non-zero probabilities that are nonetheless very, very tiny while they make mathematical sense, we know they don't happen in real life. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but this issue, this fundamental paradox, is one that's been discussed by mathematicians and philosophers for a long time. And so I want to review a little bit of that real quick, because this is really not a math question per se. This isn't we do some calculations and come to a number. It's what makes sense as humans to consider a probability of a thing that could actually happen, as opposed to someone that's never going to happen even if the probability is positive. So I'm going to call that a negligible probability. For the probabilists in the audience, there is a notion of negligible probability, and that's formal, and this is not that. This is an informal notion of negligible probability. So the Count of Buffon, back in the 1700s, mathematicians known from Buffon's needle problem, he said that anything that happens with probability of less than 1 in 10,000, we go about our lives if it's not going to happen. So any probability less than that, we just ignore. That's his thinking. Condorcet, a little bit later, he was a scientist, mathematician, and philosopher, active around the time of the French Revolution, famous for some thoughts on voting. That's mostly what people know about him now. He said that any probability less than 1 in 144,768, we can pretend that that doesn't happen. And so he had a really interesting argument for that. And I think it's kind of illustrative of the way we're thinking here, which is, he says, look, pretend you're in the 1700s. If you're going to take a boat across the English Channel, you don't prepare yourself by making a big effort to update your will and talk to your next of kin. You just do it. So therefore, you act as if you will not die crossing the English Channel. And at that time, the odds of death on a commercial transit of the English Channel was 1 in 144,768. So that was his reasoning. According to actuarial tables at the time, also, that was also the odds of an English male between the ages of 37 and 47 would die in the next week. Similar reasoning in that case. So that was his rule. Later on, people got a little bit more conservative, and Emile Borel and Littlewood in separate works. That's Littlewood from Hardy and Littlewood. Both wrote that 1 in a million was sort of the right cutoff for negligible probability. I have a picture of Borel there because, in fact, I learned about this from reading a popular book. Borel was a famous probabilist, a very successful research mathematician who also wrote some popular books on probability. You can go buy them yourselves, like I did on Amazon. You just still get copies. He said 1 in a million. Anything below that, we live our lives as if it's not going to happen. I can't resist mentioning here also that Borel served briefly as the French equivalent of Secretary of the Navy. You don't see a lot of successful academics who in scientific research areas who just briefly serve as a secretary of something like the Navy in the US. That's just a little unusual. Anyway, so he said 1 in a million, and that's what we're going to use as our cutoff. So the reason for using this most conservative, this is the lowest probability number, is just it's the most conservative choice. We're trying to identify who's up to shenanigans here. So we're going to do everything in our power to make people look like they're not up to shenanigans. Every time we have a choice to make, we're going to make the most conservative choice to make them look like they are legitimate gamblers. And that's why we're going to take the most conservative choice here. That's the idea. So let's translate this into some number. By the way, I should say, you might have been objecting to some of the things on that previous slide about this, how we live our lives and negligible probability. And this actually a really important technical point there, which I'm sure some of you are already thinking of, is that if you do 1 million experiments, then a 1 in a million event is actually likely to happen. So you have to be careful about how many times you're going to do the thing that you're checking the probability of before you throw away the probability. You got to be careful about the order you do that in. It is a familiar problem in lab science when you do a bunch of experiments and you're measuring p-values. And I've copied in here the relevant XKCD, as you knew there must be. And so in this XKCD, they do 20 experiments checking to see if there's a connection between jelly beans of various colors and acne. And sure enough, in one of the experiments, they do find a correlation that exists with probability less than 1 in 20. So paraphrasing incorrectly the definition of p-value there. So that's a common problem in experimental in lab sciences. It's the same issue we face here. Just to be clear, here are the probabilities. If you do 1 million experiments and you have a 1 in a million event, it's going to happen at least once with probability 63%. So it's actually likely to happen. So we do have to be careful about that. And so as a consequence, we're not actually going to use 1 in a million. We're going to use an even smaller number for our probability threshold. We're going to sort of pretend that every person in Florida is a lottery gambler. So that's our number of experiments. Everyone in Florida is playing the lottery. In fact, they're not. Most states, it's like 50, 60% of people ever buy lottery tickets. So it's a little, this is again, a conservative choice. Population of Florida is about 20 million. There's a, our probability thing is 1 in a million. So our probability threshold is actually going to be the product of those two, which is 5 times 10 to the minus 14th. Now, I'm a scientist. I'm totally comfortable with the scientific notation, but in my heart of hearts, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around exponents like that. My gut has not quite caught up to my scientific training. So let me just give you some benchmarks in case those are useful comparisons. The population of one Florida is about 20 Rhode Islands. 20 Floridas is about the same population as the US. 390 Floridas is about the same population as the Earth, but we're talking about 1 million Floridas, right? So it's a lot more. 1 million Floridas is the number of stars in 40 Milky Ways-ish. We don't actually know how many stars there are in the Milky Way. It's pretty, the estimates are kind of low quality, but let's just bear with me. So this probability threshold I'm talking about here, you should think about it this way. Suppose you and your friend were somehow available, had at your hands a list of all the stars in 40 galaxies the size of the Milky Way. And your friend picks one, and you pick one, and you pick the same one. That's that probability that we're talking about. So it's clearly not going to happen. Okay, so that's our probability threshold. Okay, great. So that's nice. I feel like we've kind of, at least, whether you're convinced or not, we've set up a framework for addressing the paradox. We've set a threshold. Things are less likely than this. They don't happen. We can ignore them. So now let's talk about how we can turn this into statements about lottery spending. So I'm going to tell you what we calculate. And there's starter versions of this problem that are college level homework problems. So for example, if you knew how much someone spent on lottery tickets in a single game, and you knew the rules of that game, because you can, in Florida, the rules of the games are all posted on their website. You can look them up very easily. Then you can calculate the probability that they won at least W times in that game, where W is, you know it from the list, right? We have the list of all the prizes. We know how many prizes they won in that game. So I tell you for college probability, that's a homework exercise in the binomial distribution, or maybe the Poisson distribution, if you want to think about it that way. So you can calculate it. It's not clear how to do something with that as far as answering Lawrence's question about like, are these people up to something, or are they just lucky? So what we can do is we can reverse the problem. So we take the probability threshold, which is the answer to the previous approach, and the W, which we know from the spreadsheets. These are two things we do know. And we can reverse that whole process, and we can get a minimum amount spent on lottery tickets. There are a lot of gotchas in that statement, but that's the basic idea. That's the key idea. So what I'd like to do now is just use that reasoning and show you a couple of examples of where it takes you. So here's an example where the numbers are made up, but they're very realistic. So suppose you're playing a game that costs $1 a ticket, and the probability of winning is about 1 in 1,667. This is an example of a box bet in what Rhode Island calls the numbers game. In other states, it's called play for or cash for, some variation of that. And in this game, you pick a 4-digit number, and the box bet, you're saying you get some permutation of the digits, and this is a specific subset of that. Suppose someone wins that bet 200 times. Then this process would say, the naive estimate is which is what a lot of people would do. So the naive estimate is just multiply these numbers together, the $1, the 1667, and the 200, and you get $333,400 for the spending. So That's a naive estimate. How good is that estimate? Well, using the reasoning described on the previous slide, you get a different lower bound. You get $185,475, and that's a lower bound. So this very conservative view, that's how much you would expect them to have spent, at least, on a very conservative estimate. Now, just to be clear, it's also one of the things I learned is that you should always do like an edge case example just to check that you haven't done something silly. So as an example of that, let's talk about Mega Millions. So in Mega Millions, that costs $2 a ticket. You probably are familiar with this wherever you live because it's a multi-state lottery. Most of the states participate at this point. In Mega Millions, the probability of winning the jackpot is 1 in 333 million. And so suppose someone wins a jackpot. Then the naive estimate, of course, is to multiply the numbers $2, 303, and 1 together and get $606 million. That's crazy. We know that's crazy because lots of people who win the jackpot bought one ticket or a handful of tickets. So our lower estimate of spending, it turns out, is also $2, which is what we know has to be the right answer. They have to buy at least one ticket in order to win anything. And we know that people can win from just one ticket. So we have not, while we are trying to eliminate this notion that people just get lucky and win a bunch of prizes, we haven't thrown away luck altogether, because I think this $2 estimate is definitely assuming you get lucky, right? I've certainly, when I buy a Mega Millions ticket for $2, I certainly don't have any expectation of winning the jackpot. And if I did, I certainly would have been crushed the many, many times I've done that. I talk about buying lottery tickets. I do. I admit it. I enjoy the anticipation of thinking about winning. I spend maybe $20 to $40 a year on lottery tickets. No judgments. Some of you buy a lot of chocolate bars. You don't expect to become rich off those. I don't expect to become rich off the lottery. It's all fine. It's recreational. Fine. So what we actually do, the actual complicated process that we have to do in general, is that people won prizes in lots of different games. And so we actually have to find the optimal way the person could allocate their money. Just to, again, give them the benefit of the doubt. Assume they were targeting the number of wins they ended up with. They spent their money the optimal way to do so. And then try to figure out what do the same kind of analysis we did on the previous slide. And so it's an optimization problem, is what it ends up being. And you can use numerical optimization techniques to get at it. There are some technical traps that are hidden here that I just want to mention, just so that, because they're kind of serious, but we've addressed them. So one is that it's really inobvious, but not all lottery games are independent. So if you look at these frequent prize winners, a lot of them have won many, many prizes in the numbers game. But they win it in different kinds of bets. So one bet is called a straight bet. So you're betting the number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then later on, they pull out the winning number on TV and it's 1, 2, 3, 4. You win a prize. If it's some other number, you don't. That's a straight bet. Or they could bet on a box bet, which says some permutation of those digits is the winning number. Those are two dependent bets. The outcome of one tells you something about the outcome of the other. So one has to disentangle those. And so that's a thing that has to be done. And we did that in our 2015 paper. Another thing you have to know is, like, what's the optimal way to collect a certain number of wins in draw games like the numbers? And it's not the time to delve into that, but it turns out to be really inobvious how to prove what the right strategy is. And that's a subject of a paper in the Electronic Journal of Combinatorics that I wrote with Richard Stong, and it just came out about a week ago, I guess. So it's a little bit subtle. It relies on this really sophisticated count of lattice paths. So it's some fairly non-trivial combinatorics go into proving that the optimal strategy is indeed optimal. But you need to know that. And that actually was factored into the example before with someone winning the box bet. Okay, so the point of this is to say that what I described on the previous slide is a really good outline. There turned out to be lots of technical hangups, and that's why we had to write a bunch of papers to talk about it, is the idea. But if you understand what happened on the previous slide, then you have the basic idea, and everything else are just technical details of interest to specialists. So, okay, so we got a plan. We have a way to go about it. So you could just, what happened in Florida? So let's talk about that. So we had article that Lawrence published in the newspaper talked about all these frequent winners, including a specific frequent winner from Pompano Beach who had claimed 252 prizes up to that point in the lottery. So they gained 166 prizes in the Play 4, that's this numbers game, of a variety of different kinds of bets, 83 different scratcher games, and then 3 miscellaneous other kinds of games. So we ran that through our system and you get a number. And so he spent at least $2 million on these lottery tickets. I'm measuring the amount of money spent on tickets in the sense of how much did they pay the clerk. I'm not talking about profit and loss for a variety of reasons. It makes everything technically much easier. And in fact, this is totally sufficient for a reason I'll explain now. So I say he spent $2 million on lottery tickets, but that doesn't sound maybe that doesn't sound bad to you. I mean, after all, in the lottery, we're always talking about these multi-million dollar amounts of money. So maybe that just washes out. Also, you might think, oh, well, if he's won some big prizes, he can afford to do that. So that's another totally reasonable response. But I want to point out there's another way in which that $2 million number is unreasonable, which is that it means that he had to be spending at least $1,000 a day on average on lottery tickets, because this is just over a few year period. Now that number is a shocking number. I'm not because he doesn't have the money, but because just doing that is physically hard. It's a job. You got to go to the store. You got to buy $1,000 worth of tickets. If you're spending that much, you probably have a plan. So you probably have to make sure you go to the right store, which has enough tickets of the game you want to play that they can sell you. Also, if you're spending $1,000 a day, people are going to notice. The clerks at the store where you buy your tickets, they are going to remember you and they're going to have stories about you. So when Lawrence goes down and he talks to the clerks of those stores, they're going to be like, oh yeah, that guy, I know him. So it's a lot of work. It leaves a big trail. People notice it. So that makes it a thing that we can investigate in a very convenient way. It also makes it seem pretty unlikely that this person is doing it, because that is a ton of money to be spending on lottery tickets. There might, for example, be news stories just about the spending, regardless of prizes won. If you don't believe me, by the way, you might be sitting there thinking, oh, no, I could spend $1,000 on lottery tickets. I invite you to give it a try. Just try it for 2 weeks and see how you do. I don't mean in terms of winning and losing, but just how strenuous is it to spend $1,000 on lottery tickets every day for a couple of weeks? And this guy kept it up for 3 years or something. So 5 years anyway. So I invite you to try it if you don't believe me. All right. So by the way, what's the upshot of that? The upshot of that is that, so he didn't just get lucky. We don't believe that he actually spent this money on tickets. So that means he's not going to be spending a ton of money on lottery tickets option. So that means he's up to shenanigans. That's the deduction. So the question is, what might those shenanigans be? And that's what I'd like to talk to you about now. So just to remind you all how it all works, here's a picture of a scratcher ticket up here. And this is the part underneath the wax, which tells you whether you won or lost. It looks like this one lost. Speaking for myself, this is a little bit embarrassing to admit. I sometimes misread scratcher tickets and think I've won when I've lost, or lost when I've won. It's a thing that happens to everybody. In particular, and as a consequence of that, when you go claim your prize, if your lottery ticket wins and you want to go for $2 and you want to go to the gas station and claim your prize, they don't try to read the icons here and figure out whether you won or not. What they do is, if you may have noticed, is they scan this barcode here, and the cash register, the lottery machine, tells them whether or not you've won and what your prize is. So the first scam is that the clerks do something called pin scratching. And so this is an unusual shenanigan, but it does happen. So the clerk's alone in the store, and they take a ticket off the roll. They scratch off the wax just over the barcode. You have to do it very carefully so that no one else can really, anyway, you'll see why in a second. You scratch the wax off the barcode, you scan it, and if the ticket is a winner, the clerk buys it, turns it in as the winner, and gets recorded as the winner on our list. Oops. The other option, of course, is if they scan it and it isn't a winner, it's a loser, they just wait until the next drunk customer comes in and sells it to them. So that's the way the scam works. That's why the clerk makes money, because they only buy winning tickets, and they get recorded as the winner for all of the winning tickets. So that is a thing that happens. Someone gets arrested for it maybe once a year, maybe a little less, at least according to newspaper articles in the US. Maybe it's happening and more than that, and police aren't issuing press releases or something. Another thing is a scam called clerks can steal winning tickets from gamblers. And the way this one works is the gambler comes in, they got some scratched lottery tickets, and they hand them to the clerk and say, hey, can you cash these for me? And the clerk takes there's a couple of varieties of this scam. One is the clerk takes a winner and says, it's a loser, I'll throw it away for you. And then the clerk turns in the ticket and claims the prize and gets recorded as the winner. Or say it's $1,000 winner, the clerk pays out $100, and again, the clerk takes it to the lottery office and gets recorded as the winner and claims the big prize. So that's a thing that happens. It actually happens a fair amount. There's a lot of newspaper articles about it. So that's a thing that's ongoing. The lotteries tend to run sting operations about this, because obviously it's really bad for lottery sales if people who believe they've won tickets feel like they got cheated when they tried to turn in the winning ticket. So this is definitely a thing that happens. Another thing that happens is that a middleman can buy winning tickets from gamblers. So sometimes this is called ticket aggregation. These people sometimes call it discounting, and there's other names for it that you'll read. So in this scheme, a gambler has a winning ticket that has to go to a lottery office to get cashed. It's worth $600 or more. But the gambler doesn't want to go there. And there's a few reasons for that, why they might not want to go. One is laziness. You got to drive there. And like I said, if you're in the corner of Rhode Island, it might be an hour drive to get to Cranston. The lottery office is only open Monday through Friday on regular work days. Lottery office might mail you a check instead of giving you cash. The middleman probably pays you cash. So that all sounds pretty innocent. This is just someone providing a service like a delivery person would. By the way, in this scheme, the middleman gets recorded as the winner, right? Because they're the one claiming the prize. And if someone doing this as a business would necessarily claim many prizes and be listed in Lawrence's spreadsheet. So this is another way that you would get on our list of suspicious people. So let me talk about why this activity is fairly shady. I think we all agree that the first two bullets are bad activity. The third one is actually surprisingly shady. So one shady reason why why the gambler might not want to turn in their own ticket is that if they owe back child support, the lottery is just going to garnish that right out of their winnings. And so by having the middleman turn it in, they avoid having to pay that child support. So I think dodging child support's that's kind of shady. There's another pretty shady aspect to it, which is that it turns out that, I said one of the reasons why you might not want to turn in your own ticket is because of impatience. You want your money now. In particular, if you're a real fan of the drug use, you might be impatient to get your winnings so that you can party. So it turns out that the people who want to make use of this service may often fall in that category. So the middleman in this case is pretty exploitative. It turns out that if you are, as a gambler, have $1,000 ticket, the middleman, he's not going to pay you full rate because he's not going to pay you $1,000 because he's got to do a job. He's got to go to the lottery office, and he's going to have to pay income tax on the winnings. So they're going to pay you something less than $1,000. So if the gambler is just trying to avoid taxes, they have the luxury of shopping around and finding the best price. The going street rate for that job is $500 to $600 for $1,000 tickets. That's what a middleman will charge, according to the police. On the other hand, if you're motivated because you want your money today, you need it in a hurry, maybe because you want to go party, then you're going to get $200 to $300. And that means this is a really exploitative process on the part of the middleman. By the way, middlemen often, it does happen. I'm not saying they're all this way, but conveniently in a business partnership with drug dealers, It's a good way for them to get the more lucrative drug user, gambler in this scenario, and increase their profits. And then, of course, once they've paid out, they can redirect them back to their partner. So it's not a good cycle. So here's a third reason why this middleman scenario, this ticket aggregation thing, is pretty shady, and that's money laundering. So if you notice the way I've described this, it provides a venue for money laundering. Suppose you're the middleman and you are a criminal. Then you have a bunch of money in the form of cash that you'd like to have in the banking system so you could do things like buy a house with it. So what you do when you buy the winning ticket from the gamblers, you give them cash. It can be dirty cash. The gambler doesn't care. But when you go to the lottery office, you get a check. You get money from the lottery that's in the banking system already. So in this way, you've laundered money and you've done it at a profit. And that is just a miracle. If you're thinking about money laundering, as a criminal, money laundering costs you a lot of money. So you might be delighted with the scenario. And in fact, there have been criminal organizations that have used exactly this process for money laundering. So even if the other items don't bother you, I argue that governments should not be in the business of creating profitable money laundering mechanisms. I think that's not what government should be doing. So they shouldn't be allowing middlemen for that reason. Or maybe not have lotteries, but I personally like the lottery. You may view differently. So Lawrence went to go talk to the Pompano Beach guy. And in the first interview, he said that he never won. He claimed that someone was impersonating him to claim the prizes. But in the second interview, he just admitted. And in Florida, it is illegal to be a ticket aggregator, to do this middleman business. And he just admitted it. He says, that's how I make my living. I just do it. I'm not going to lie. So in one hand, nice story. We have some math. We argue that this specific person, based on publicly available data, was potentially committing a crime. When he's investigated, when he's asked about it, he just admits to committing the crime. So success math, yay math. It's true, it is pretty exciting, but the story's a little more complicated. It turned out that this guy was working for a larger organization. And so he was actually one of the exploitees in the scenario. But anyway, this drew further law enforcement attention. So the story still has a justice ending. Okay, mathematically, there's a lot of subtlety in the Florida situation that I find totally fascinating. So the guy from Pompano Beach, he won 252 prizes, but we thought he was up to shenanigans. There was a guy from Florida who had claimed an astounding 578 prizes, and yet the math said he maybe just got lucky. So, I mean, why does that make sense? And so there's an interesting reason about it. The particular game he played counted prizes in a weird way. So what happened was, turns out he really likes the numbers game. And in Florida, at the time, if you bet $300, say, on a given lottery, a given drawing of the numbers, say 1, 2, 3, 4, instead of printing you one slip with that number and that bet, $300 bet on it, you would get 300 $1 slips. So whenever he'd win one of these bets, and he did bet in this fashion as some on-the-ground shoe leather investigation revealed, you get counted as winning 300 prizes, even though they're all completely dependent. I mean, they have the same outcome. One wins, or they all win, or none of them do. So in fact, it was really just a handful of big prizes that he won, 5-ish. And also, when Lawrence went and did some on-the-ground investigation, it turns out that guy's gambling is pretty well documented. So as I said, if you're spending a lot of money on lottery tickets every day, the clerks are going to remember you. There's going to be stories about you for sure. So that's why we have I'm not saying the guy's not up to something. I have no idea, but I have absolutely no reason to suspect that he has done anything shady. So, all right. So that's what happened in Florida. And there are these newspaper articles about it. So Lawrence published information about all these people and what we thought their minimum spending was and so on. And it was kind of a bit of a scandal because it was a gubernatorial election year in Florida. And the governor controls who's in charge of the lottery and so on. So it was a ongoing news story. And it turned out that it spread across the country. The next The next state we looked at was Georgia. I worked with Sean Sposito from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And then after that, with other reporters at other newspapers and some of the in TV stations, and some of these were things that were done completely independently of us, that were follow-on investigations. I noticed Rhode Island's not on the list. Rhode Island, being a small state, it might not have enough people up to hijinks or something, I'm not sure. On the other hand, it turns out that every state not only has its own quirky laws and own quirky lottery games, my experience is that every state has its own criminal scheme as well. So in every state we investigated, there was something just weird about some part of the data that looked like someone was really up to something. And it was kind of specific to that state's details, and we didn't necessarily have time to investigate it. So your state too is probably on that list, in the sense of there's something weird going on. So, it might be a fun thing to go look into if your curiosity is piqued. Another aspect of all this that I find fascinating is as scientists, we got super lucky that we started with Florida, because it turned out that Florida had enough craziness going on that enough shady activity that we could detect it using math. So that's good. And yet there wasn't so rampant that it was easy. So we had to develop all these techniques. We ended up writing all these papers to support the techniques that we used and so on. So that was a pretty interesting experience. But in contrast to that, the next state that we tried, Georgia, like I said, with the AJC, we found out later had made a policy decision not to do anything about ticket aggregation, the middleman scheme I mentioned earlier, Shenanigan I mentioned earlier. And so it turned out that in that data, middlemen seem to be so rampant and so widespread in Georgia that it did not take any subtlety to try to find them. So in some sense, we kind of got lucky to start with this Florida, which is this perfect sweet spot. There's something to find, and it wasn't super easy. Don't get a bad impression about Georgia, though. Now, if they're aware of the problem, they've made a policy decision to switch around, and they're making some real progress. So we've seen some changes in a lot of states as a consequence of this. Brendan referred to this in his introduction earlier. So one thing that's really easy for the lottery to do is if they think something shady is happening at a lottery outlet, they can just shut down lottery sales at that store. And the people who run the store really don't like that. So it is actually a thing. They've installed a lot more self-checking ticket terminals. That's a really hard thing for me to say for some reason. And what this means is if you go buy a lottery ticket in lots of stores, lots of states, you do it from a vending machine that's located in the front of the grocery store, say. And that vending machine typically also has a barcode scanner on it, so you can scan your own scratcher ticket. And that's to defeat this clerk steals from the gambler shenanigan. So that's a defense against that. And of course, now there's phone apps. Rhode Island, for example, has a phone app where you can scan the barcode on your scratcher ticket using your phone app to see if you won, and if so, how much. Also, there's been changes in policy in multiple states to pursue ticket aggregators. Like I said, some states had made a policy decision to not pursue them. So an example of that would be Georgia. And over here on the right-hand side, you got a picture of Debbie Alford, who at the time was the Georgia lottery director. She announced that they made a change, that they would then pursue ticket aggregators, and they have been doing a lot of stuff in Georgia to address their rampant issues in that regard. Very aggressive, a positive reaction to having a problem highlighted to say, okay, we're going to do something about it. In Florida, the Florida lottery secretary resigned. Don't get the wrong impression. It wasn't just because of this. She had some other scandals that came out after this one, but it is nonetheless true that this is a thing that happened. And then also there have been arrests and jail time for these and related violations. So some people, it is for ticket aggregation, for example, and in other cases, in investigating these things, they've turned up other possibly unrelated to the lottery issues that have led to jail time. So those are some of the consequences of these math papers that we wrote, and some real on-the-ground detective work by Lawrence and Sean and other reporters across the US. So in conclusion, what I'd like you to take away here is that math really surfaced some shenanigans just by looking at publicly available data without the extra analytic insight that the lottery has available to them with their extra data. We were able to identify people who are up to shenanigans, which in some states were criminal. And that because of revealing this information, what's going on, there are changes in state policy, and there have been lawsuits and law enforcement actions, lots of changes. And like I said, these things are widespread. As I promised you at the beginning, this is a nationwide phenomenon. But because each state has its own games, rules, and criminal subculture, I guess I would say, there's a lot of local variation. So if you want to look for the kinds of hijinks we looked for, then you're welcome to use our Jupyter Notebook, which is up on GitHub. But if you just look at the data, you may, using some exploratory data analysis, you're quite likely to find some other interesting thing that we didn't find that is also might be of interest to law enforcement, for example. So that's what I have to say. Brendan, do we have some questions from the audience?
So actually the questions are just coming in. So there's some praise, being a phenomenal talk. So maybe I'll clap. So I'm looking. So one question is, did you do any Monte Carlo simulations to see how the distribution of ticket expenses is shaped above your lower bound?
Well, so it turns out that we can actually find the exact answer and then look at the distribution of ticket purchases that meet that lower bound. And it's really interesting to see how the allocation occurs. One of the things that you might have noticed in the examples is when we compared Mega Millions versus the one where they won 100 or 200 prizes in the numbers game, you get a much higher lower bound in the multiple wins in the same game situation. And so you find that that actually contributes a lot to your lower bound. I'm sure a lot more can be said about the shape of this frontier that I'm not prepared to talk about now. There's a lot to be investigated. And one of the things that's tricky is that the numbers involved are all so infinitesimally small that, anyway, or big, as the case may be with spending.
So another question that came in is, based on your work, would you choose one lottery over another? I guess
right.
It's clear whether it's as a player or as someone engaging in shenanigans. I'll let you pick the focus.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, we really focused on there's an interesting issue there. So we really focused only on dollars in terms of what you pay to buy the tickets. And on the winning side, we only counted number of wins. So if you're a gambler, you probably want to get money. So you probably want to redo all of this with a focus on how much you win. But if you just wanted to count number of wins, then we did find a particular variant of the numbers game where there's a reasonable probability of getting a win. And so this is not a good investment. As a way to make money, it doesn't work. But if you're a pathological gambler, you might easily gamble away your house. And so we figured that if you gambled away a median house in Florida, you could collect almost 200 of these prizes worth $600 or more. You'd be broke at the end of it, but that's kind of the expected outcome. So you can totally get on our list and look super shady and still only lose a couple $100,000. So this is another illustration of how it's really important to go through the whole math process and not just say someone won a couple hundred large prizes and therefore they're guilty of something.
So there was a question about, are there any really lucky people around? Or maybe, is there any things other than the Hollywood example, cases where people had unlikely winnings that turned out to be, based on the mathematics, not implausible?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that there are other people like the Hollywood guy around. I think what I would say about luck, I think the quote about luck is probability taken personally. So my view is that when you do an experiment many, many times, meaning, how about this? You take 1 million people and each of them do the experiment once. The person who gets that 1 in a million outcome is going to go like, I'm the lucky one. But in fact, probably at least someone was going to get that, and it just happened to be them. But as humans, we're hardwired to perceive luck, and I think it's an illusion. That's my take.
So one open question is, so can you actually use math to win at the lotto, or do you just have to do something that's unethical or illegal? That is,
yeah.
Is there, how often is there a math strategy that will help you win?
That's a great question. Well, I just want to point out, I didn't write that phrase, so I'm going to disavow that. So yeah, doing something shady is a great way to make money in the lottery. But honestly speaking, so my previous, the prize winning paper that Brendan mentioned about the lottery that I wrote was about, it does happen sometimes that if you look at some very specific lottery drawings, you can make money at them. But it turns out there's still an inferior investment to buying stocks on average. So, I'm happy to point you to that 2010 paper on finding good bets in the lottery. Honestly, I think the best way to make money in the lottery, and I suggest consulting with a lawyer before following this because it's very likely to be illegal in many jurisdictions, is to run your own lottery. Because that is a great way to make money. In the old days, state lotteries are a newish invention. And in the old days, there were a bunch of privately run lotteries. And they used to, at least nominally, pay out more than the current state-run lotteries because they just had to pay for their operations. Whereas the current state-run lotteries have to pay for their own operations and pay tax and income to pay money to the state. So, but like I said, that's probably illegal in most places. So again, please do consult with a lawyer.
And I'm fairly sure it's illegal in Rhode Island in case there are people from local people who are following this. So you talked about lotteries at the state level. Is it possible to do this analysis for multi-state lotteries? How hard is it to get the data? Have you found any surprising behavior in multi-state games?
So the Florida data, for example, did include some multi-state data. So the prizes, at least below some threshold, I believe, are still handed out by the state level organizations. Like for Mega Millions, like that was one of the prizes claimed by our Pompano Beach gentleman. And the answer is not really. So the signal that we can detect using our methods is people who have claimed many prizes and those tend to be in the $1,000 to $5,000 range. And so most of those people are doing one of these illegal shenanigans, and those shenanigans, the specific ones I described, do not mesh well with the multi-state games like Mega Millions. So, yeah.
So, so there are some lotteries that are not random. I guess there can be dependents. So I guess your analysis included these, analyzing potential dependencies among different winnings. Is that correct?
Yeah, although I would say that maybe the questioner has in mind a different kind of dependency. So the dependencies that we analyzed were the cases where the bets are obviously dependent. So betting that it's either 1, 2, 3, 4 that's drawn or some permutation of those digits. As far as dependencies that are not supposed to be there, it has happened. For example, if you're a lottery whose numbers are picked by a random number generator on a computer, you might pick a bad random number generator, and then there will be these dependencies in there. That could happen, but those are really focused in time, and you're relying then on a misdesigned lottery. So, in generally speaking, for lotteries, there aren't dependencies from one drawing to the next, and there's been lots of studies about that to support that claim.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to close the discussion. So thank you, Dr. Garibaldi, for a really fun, interesting talk. So it's great to see the story, and thank all the people that tuned in or joined us. So I just want to make one announcement. In October, we have 2 public lectures planned, both concerned with voting. And so Sherrod Goel from Stanford and Jonathan Mattingly from Duke will be giving public lectures next month. And so you should see announcements of this on our website soon. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Skip, for a wonderful talk. It's great to see you. Hope you can come back to Rhode Island soon.
I sure hope so too.
And thank you for the staff for making this run so smoothly.
Thank you all. Thank you to the staff as well. This is great.